trained in literary studies.
Shifa, you're not audible. Yeah, I think she was left out of the meeting. She's just joining us in a minute.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
I'm so sorry, because of some network error, it went off. So yes, I was talking about, she has been trained in literary studies at Lady Shri Ram College, New Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, Ruprecht Karls Universität, Heidelberg. And she is, her main area of interest is mainly post-colonial studies, cultural studies, digital humanities, and emerging literature studies. So I welcome you, ma'am, to enlighten our students with your subject expertise. Over to you, Afreen.
Thank you so much, Shifa. Before we begin, I would like to add, in the words of Henry Ford, he says, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success." With today's program, it is an effort by the department to enable this kind of cooperation and collaboration, allowing for the critical reflection on the making and remaking of experiences on the environs of the knowledge system engaging and contribute to. I would now like to request Professor Dr. Drupadi Chattopadhyay, ma'am, to enlighten the students. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm very humbled at so many adjectives that have been used for me. I'm really scared now. And I don't know whether I would be able to live up to all the attributes that have been assigned to me. What I intend to do today in today's lecture is basically, this is a, as you understand, I think this is a very, very broad sort of topic. And I've been given 1 hour. And I think we have already lost some 15-20 minutes of that 1 hour. So I basically have about 45 minutes. So I don't think I'll be able to do justice to all the aspects that Dr. Barkale talked about. But I'm going to highlight certain entry points into this understanding of the diaspora. And therefore, if you look at the title of my talk, I have focused on three key areas around which the discourse or the studies of the diaspora or about the diaspora have been centered. One is a contextual understanding. So where, and here I'm talking about, in particular, talking about the South Asian diaspora, because otherwise it is very, very vast. And, migrations have happened, especially as we will see after colonization. Mass migrations have happened across the globe because of various historical, political, and social reasons. And it is impossible to study all kinds of diaspora in basically one paper or one lecture. So I'm going to first, I'm going to limit myself to looking at South Asian diaspora. And within that, you will see that these are the three sort of key areas on which a lot of conversation has happened, of the contexts of migration. Why have they migrated? What kind of historical, social, political reasons are there for these migrations? How do they contribute to the larger understanding of migration? And what has been called ethnospatial studies, as it were. Then the second sort of important, very important idea has been to look at what kind of imaginations have they produced. right? Taking from the word diasporic imaginary. And this is a word that a lot of you are familiar with. So what kind of imaginations have these migrations allowed, fostered? And that is something that a lot of diaspora conversations around the diaspora has talked about. And the last one is something that Professor Pandurang alluded to, which is the understanding of borders, understanding of cartographies, understanding of spaces. How do we understand spaces? Taking off basically from Lefebvre's idea that a space is not just in terms of borders that you find on paper that has been drawn onto maps, but space is also socially produced. So how do we understand these spaces? How do we understand these cartographies that these diasporas have created? So they have broken down, essentially challenged this notion of homogeneous identities. So how does it change the way that we look at spaces? So these are the three, according to me, the three very important areas or directions in which diaspora theories, diaspora critical understanding of the diaspora, especially in the South Asian context, has emerged. There is really a lot to be said. So I'm going to try and focus it through these three sort of parameters that I have just alluded to. So, why is it not moving to the, yeah. So to the very basic. So the term diaspora, if you go to any dictionary, I have here referred to the Merriam-Webster, but if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, to any dictionary, they will tell you that the term diaspora is of Greek origin, and which means to disperse, to scatter. It also alludes to the spores, to the scattering of the spores. And it was originally referred to the Jewish community and describe a very old thing. Its first and principal meaning relates to the settling of the Jewish people outside of Palestine after the Babylonian exile thousands of years ago. However, recent research has found that the word is quite a bit older than the previously thought. It can be found as far back as 1594 in a translation of Lambert de News, a fruitful commentary upon the 12 small prophets. And here, the quotation is given. But basically, it was meant for the scattering of the Jewish people to what Connor refers to as a very interesting case where the diaspora becomes ultimately larger than the people who stay back. So even now, if you look at the population, the Jewish population in Israel, you see that the number of Jewish people outside of Israel is far more than the people in Israel. And that has been adapted to the modern, that word has been adapted to the modern context to mean very, very similar things. But defining what is a diaspora, right? So a lot of people have been migrating since the beginning of time, as it were, right? So migration is not new. Scattering of people is not new. Rather, it is one of the oldest things, as it were, central to human imagination, central to human history. How do we then distinguish the notion of the diaspora from any other historical migration that might have happened? Okay, so there are various kinds of migrations, and migrations have happened since the beginning of time, as I was just telling you. So how do we, in the modern context, in the present times, how do we define the diaspora? If you're not Jewish and you are part of a diaspora, then how do you define it? And here I think Vijay Mishra, in his very famous book, Paul, in his very famous article and then a book also that has come out, he's written about what he calls the diasporic imaginary, where he defines the diaspora in a very concrete way. Just a second. He says, diasporas refer to people who do not feel comfortable with their non-hyphenated identities as indicated on their passports. So people, essentially, he says that diasporas are people who are not happy with the hyphenated identities that are assigned to them, right? So they do not believe or completely accept the identity, the citizenship that appears on their passports. So he says diasporas are people who would want to explore the meaning of the hyphen, which is very important because this is an idea that comes back again and again in the context of the diaspora. That people who are interested in the hyphen, not a homogeneous identity that appears on either side of the hyphen, but perhaps not press the hyphen too far for the fear that this would lead to massive communal schizophrenia. So I think this particular line is very important in terms of how we understand the diaspora. He's saying that although they want to explore what is there in the hyphen or what the identity that is placed at the intersection of two other identities, you would not want to press that hyphen too far so that that hyphen sort of gives way and there is what he calls massive communal schizophrenia. They are precariously lodged within an episteme of real or imagined displacements, self-imposed sense of exile. They are haunted by specters, by ghosts arising from within that encourage irredentist or separatist movements, right? This is again a very, very important concept. He writes about this in another essay where he talks about haunting, memory, where he talks about this idea that this idea of ghosts, and he says that the diasporas can be represented or best represented by what he calls an impossible mourning. So this is they are constantly in a sense of mourning, as he says, because of real or imagined displacement and their sense of self-imposed exile. They're haunted by specters, by ghosts arising from within, right? So they are constantly unhappy, right? Unhappy about their current present state of the way that their identities are construed. And another very important thing that he says in the last line, and this is something that we are going to take up later, diasporas are both celebrated by late or post-modernity and maligned by early modernity. So he says that if you look at early modernity or the beginnings of these movements, especially in the case of India, where you have indentured laborers, etc., moving, then you see they were maligned in early modernity and in late modernity, the time that specifically in the 20th century, they are a cause for celebration. So then we go to William Safran, and he gives us 6 pointers, which I think is very important. And he says that if you look at these 6 pointers and you sort of assign them to a community, then you know that they are diasporic. And let us go over these 6 characteristics. This is taken from Diasporas in Modern Societies, Myths of Homeland and Return. And Safran's idea about the diaspora or his concerns about the diaspora are mainly about this notion of homeland and the myth of return to the homeland. And he lists the 6 characteristics. I'll just go over them quickly. One, they or their ancestors have been dispersed from a specific original center or two or more peripheral or foreign origins. So there is a notion, at least in the diasporic community, that they come from an origin, a center. And this is where they want to go back to. This is their possibility of mythic possibility of return. Number two, they retain a collective memory, vision, or myth about their original homeland. So not only do they sort of want to go back to a certain center, they create a certain vision or myth around this original homeland, its physical locations, history, or achievements. Number three, they believe that they are not and perhaps cannot be fully accepted by their host society and therefore partly alienated and insulated from it, right? And this is something that you see in a lot of diasporic writing, that they are not and perhaps cannot be fully accepted by their host society, that they feel that they are outside it, they're not able to enter it, they're not completely accepted, and they feel alienated and insulated. Number four, they regard their ancestral homeland as their true quote unquote, and this is something that you will see, this is an idea that comes back in a lot of writing that you must have read as part of your diaspora course, that they feel that this ancestral homeland is their true ideal home, right? And this must, as you understand, must be displaced in time, right? Their previous generations, in the case of, say, Trinidad, etc., like British Guyana, Trinidad, Fiji, Mauritius, their ancestors migrated 200 or 300 years ago. And the idea of the homeland that they had was basically of an India in the 19th century. And these people, the current generation, if they feel if they feel that same sense of loss, or they believe in the same sense of loss, and they're committed to a true idea of a true ideal home, as you understand, that they're temporarily misplaced, right? Because this is an India that was left. This is an India that their ancestral homeland, or what they think of their ancestral homeland, is say 2 centuries before the time that they try to imagine or place their identities in relation to, and as a place to which they or their descendants would or should eventually return. Number 5, they believe that they should collectively be committed to the maintenance or restoration of their original homeland. And this is something that you see in a lot of diasporic writing, diasporic discourse, that there is a sense of community, or because they're displaced, or they feel they're displaced from their original homeland, they create this a community, or this communal understanding of their homeland, which they seek to maintain and restore. And number 6, they continue to relate personally or vicariously to that homeland in one way or another, and their ethno-communal consciousness and solidarity are importantly defined by the existence of such a relationship. And this is very, very important. This is something that you will see in almost all diasporic writing, that they somehow want to draw their identity from that homeland, whether directly or through secondary sources. And they have a very strong, what is called an ethno-communal consciousness, which arises from their ethnic origins and the sort of solidarity or comfort that they find in their community, and their existence, their identities are defined by this solidarity. So another question that comes up in this, we had some general discussions about the diaspora and how the diaspora can be imagined or constituted. one very important question comes up, that what is Indian about the Indian diaspora? And this is something that is debated, because, as you know, that if we think of an Indian diaspora, we are faced with this very problematic question of partition, of a separate, because this, as we will see shortly, that the context of the modern diaspora and this understanding that diasporas come about with modernity and colonization, you will understand that this idea of migration, this idea of diasporic identity, as according to the list by Saffron and Vijay Mishra, the pointers given by Vijay Mishra, you will understand that it has a lot to do with colonization, right, and racial relationship. And most of the people who traveled or started traveling, migrating, did so before independence as part of a larger British Empire. So a lot of people prefer to call the Indian diaspora not Indian diaspora, but as a South Asian diaspora, because that is probably more accurate in historical terms. And we do share a lot of commonality in terms of our ethnic origins, in terms of shared cultures with other countries in South Asia. So I think it is fair to look at the diaspora, and especially if you look at university departments in the US, they definitely prefer to call it South Asian diaspora, precisely because of this reason, that it's very, very difficult to separate India or an Indian identity from a larger South Asian identity, given our histories. And here, Avtar Bra makes a very important intervention in the early 1990s, where her book is called Cartographies of the Diaspora, Contesting Identities. She talks about space, or talks about identity or national identities not necessarily assigned by maps, but by the kind of contestations that produce these identities. So identities are not necessarily born, according to her, in terms of the nation state that you are born in, but by the way that you frame your identity vis-a-vis other existing identities. And here she coins this term, which is very important, and which is discussed very often in relation to diaspora studies, something called diaspora space, right? Where she says diaspora space is a very important sort of space, which is inside and outside, right? So the diaspora, as we discussed with Vijay Mishra, are people who are not happy with their passports. So this tension of these identities, the conflict of these identities, creates what she calls a diaspora space, a political and cultural space where identities are crafted and challenged, right? So these are not necessarily identities that you're born with, the identities which have been assigned to you, the identities which are fixed, but more as identities which are in flux, where identities can be crafted, identities can be challenged. So the diaspora, the space that the diaspora provides, becomes a more productive space rather than seen as a space which is largely maligned. And she says that this space can be utilized to challenge the construction of Asians as a homogeneous category, right? So all Asians are similar, and this sort of racial differentiation can be countered using these spaces where singular group identity is replaced by, is challenged with what she calls difference, diversity, and differentiation. So she uses these three very, very important terms: difference, diversity, and differentiation. Now, another very, very important theorist in the context of the diaspora is Homi Bhabha, who speaks on very, very similar lines, and they are essentially, be it Bhabha, Bra, or Salman Rushdie, somebody that Dr. Pandurang referred to, is talking about or is challenging, making the context, the notion of the diaspora a very potent one, by challenging this idea of authenticity and challenging this idea of origins, right? And they make this because we always see the diaspora as one step away from an original culture, something that we were alluding to, that the diaspora aspires towards an original culture, diaspora aspires towards a center. And you see that Bhabha moves away from this apologetic sort of stance that, we are not authentic enough, and the diaspora's anxiety related to authenticity, the idea of belonging, the idea of approximating an identity that they think or they imagine exists in their homeland and that they've been displaced from. So both Bhabha and Rushdie in particular breaks away from this idea and makes the diaspora a very, very potent, very, very important sort of space from where you can, you need not be apologetic, need not be scared of not being authentic, need not go back to an origin, but celebrate the sort of difference that you have. And your identity shall be framed through this difference and not necessarily by how much you aspire to, or how much or how close you are to this to an original, authentic sort of culture that you aspire towards, or your homeland, as it were. So he gives two very important concepts that I'm sure you are familiar with, but I'll just go through that. One is this notion of a third space that he talks about. So he talks about third space in the context of hyphenated identities. Say you're Indian American. So one is obviously America, the other is India, and you are somewhere located in that hyphen. And you are very uncomfortable with this notion of the hyphen because it does not, in the way that it is represented, it does not seem to have an identity of its own and a place, a legitimacy of its, from where it can launch its own discourse. You don't have that legitimacy. And here you see Bhabha offers that legitimacy by theorizing about this third space, that this third space need not be a problematic space, but this third space can be, as he says, refers to the interstices between colliding culture, a liminal space. And this liminal space gives you an advantageous position, a location from where you can participate in these two cultures in a very productive way, which, as he says, which gives rise to something different, something new, and unrecognizable. So they are not merely reflections of these two contributing cultures and their identities, a new area of negotiation of meaning and representation. So he makes the third space, the inhabiting of the third space, as a new area of negotiation of meaning and representation. And that is marked by what he calls hybridity. So hybridity is not used here as in a negative connotation, but a hybrid space is where a number of negotiations, a number of contestations, a number of challenges can take place, and new identities can be formulated, new representations can be made. And he says it is significant that the productive capacities of this third space have a colonial or post-colonial provenance. For a willingness to descend into that alien territory may open the way to conceptualizing an international culture based not on exoticism of multiculturalism or the diversity of cultures, but on the inscription and articulation of cultures' hybridity. So there is no exoticization, there is no fetishization of what he calls multiculturalism and this colonial anxiety over various identities and formulations of identities, but these hybrid identities can sort of help you challenge these spaces and allow for multiple articulations that is fostered in these hybrid spaces. And Rushdie in Imaginary Homelands takes the example of Midnight's Children to talk about this moving away from this notion of origin and authenticity, where he says that it's not important for a diasporic writer when he's writing even about India or their homeland to represent it, quote unquote, in an authentic manner. That is not important. What is important is the way that he represents and the sort of challenges, that the sort of questions, the sort of political commentary that he brings in, right? And here, therefore, he gives a lot of importance to what he calls the broken mirror. And he says that the broken mirror might not offer you a singular picture, and a singular picture that is that you might feel comfortable, right? We all like singularities. We all like definitive, sort of answers, and we like to box people in homogeneous squares. So he says that it's not important to reflect everything faithfully, or what we understand as faithful representation. That is also contested. And he says that it is important to give a similar kind of space to what he calls the broken mirror. The broken mirror may actually be as valuable as the one which is supposedly unflawed, right? Look at the term that he uses here, supposedly unflawed, right? Then he says, the shards of memory acquired greater status, greater resonance, because their remains. Fragmentation made trivial things seem like symbols, and the mundane acquired numinous qualities. The broken glass is not merely a mirror of nostalgia. It is also, I believe, a useful tool with which to work in the present, right? So he says that it is important that we give equal space, equal legitimacy to a broken mirror, because a broken mirror might not produce an image that you expect it to produce, coming from what he calls a supposedly unflawed or authentic representation. But this fragmentation is important to look at various aspects of the culture that they are representing, which might not be captured in a homogeneous or in a quote unquote authentic representation of that culture. Okay, my screen is not moving for some reason.
Should I start running from my end?
Okay.
It's responding later, I guess.
So I'm going to just introduce you. You know most of these names, But I mean, this is probably the first time that a lot of the students are taking this course in diaspora studies. So here are some names of some famous writers of the Indian diaspora that you might want to go through to look at some of the concerns that we have been discussing. Now, I'm going to read a poem for you by Imtiaz Dharkar, who's a British-born born poet of Indian origin. And I believe a lot of these concerns that we just spoke about are very effectively captured in this poem that I'm going to share with you. They'll say she must be from another country. When I can't comprehend why they're burning books or slashing paintings, when they can't bear to look at God's own nakedness, and when they ban the film and they gut the seats to stop the play, and I ask why, they just smile and say she must be from another country. When I speak on the phone and the vowel sounds are off, when the consonants are hard and they should be soft, they'll catch on at once, they'll pin it down. They'll explain it right away to their own satisfaction. They'll cluck their tongues and say, she must be from another country. When my mouth goes up instead of down, when I wear a tablecloth to go to town, when they suspect I'm black or hear I'm gay, they won't be surprised. They'll purse their lips and say, she must be from another country. When I eat up the olives and spit out the pits, when I yawn at the opera in the tragic bits, when I pee in the vineyard as if it was Bombay, flaunting my bare ass, covering my face, laughing through my hands, they'll turn away, shake their heads quite sadly. She doesn't know any better, they'll say. She must be from another country. Maybe there's a country where all of us live, all of us freaks, who aren't able to give our loyalty to fat old fools, the crooks and the thugs who wear the uniform that gives them the right to wave a flag, puff out their chests, put their feet on our necks, and break their own rules. But from where we are, it doesn't look like a country. It's more like the cracks that grow between the borders behind their backs. That's where I live. And I'll be happy to say, I've never learned your customs. I don't remember your language or know your ways. I must be from another country. So I think if you look at the stanzas of this particular poem, it sort of exemplifies all the ideas that we have been discussing, the cultural alienation, the inability for somebody belonging to the diaspora to assimilate into the host culture. And most importantly, there are symbols of the host culture. There are also representations of the culture that they carry from their homeland and the how they're caught between them, so to speak. And it's very interesting if you look at the last stanza, where this is where probably Bhabha comes in, or Rashti comes in, or Brar comes in, where she talks about this diasporic space, which allows for these contestations, for these new identities to be born, where you're comfortable not belonging to one or either, one or the other, where she says that is where I live. That it's more like cracks that grow between borders behind their backs, right? So it is a stable space. It is a legitimate space to belong in these cracks and live there, right? And I'll be happy to say this is the sort of concluding stanza of the poem, and I think this sort of illustrates a lot of things that we've been talking about and thinking about. That's where I live, and I'll be happy to say I've never learned your customs. I don't remember your language or know your ways. I must be from another country. And this another country that she alludes to is not either or, but a space that is located in between, in the cracks, and she's happy belonging there, right? Now, when we've talked about what the diaspora is talking about is negotiating and their identity crisis, it's important to understand what are we dealing with. So according to, in historically dealing with in terms of the diaspora. So according to Vinay Lal, there are two kinds of South Asian diaspora. One he calls the old diaspora and one he calls the new diaspora. So he says that the old diaspora is a direct result of colonization, of imperialism, where with modernity, and this is where modernity comes in. You will remember in the beginning of the lecture, I talked about Vijay Mishra, and I talked about how modernity or early modernity maligned these migrations. And I'll just come to why they were maligned. So if you look at the old diaspora, Vinay Lal says that the old diaspora is a direct result of colonization, of imperialism, where important colonial powers moved a lot of people, labor, in particular labor, across the world, right? And that is how people spread, or sometimes they were forced to move from one place to another. And in the Indian context, or the South Asian context in particular, something very important happened in the 19th century, which made these migrations possible, or made these, or facilitated, or facilitated these mass migrations. And actually, in Britain, there was a Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which abolished slavery in most parts of the British Empire, which was followed by the 13th Amendment adopted on 18th December 1865 in the US, which officially abolished slavery. So no longer do you have slaves across the British Empire. So free labor is not available. Slaves are free. So they have to be replaced by very, very cheap labor. And that is where indentured laborers in the 19th century were taken to far-flung places such as Fiji, Mauritius, Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, Malaysia, South Africa, Sri Lanka, etc., all over the British Empire, and later on also to East Africa and various parts of Africa, not just East Africa. And after that, in the beginning of the 20th century, you also see something, right now you see a lot of writing on this, basically coming up, very interesting work, which talks about how over 2 million Indian men fought on behalf of the empire in numerous wars, including the Boer War in Africa and 2 world wars. So because of that, a lot of people also moved or were forced to move across the world. And you also have traders and professionals who migrated in large numbers, particularly to Africa. So this diaspora, this old diaspora, is necessarily, or as Vinay Lal says, largely forced migration, as opposed to the new diaspora. The diaspora sort of we associate with the Karan Johar type diaspora, what is the name of the film? Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. The kind of, our celebration of a kind of nostalgia, our association with a celebratory rhetoric of the diaspora comes in, as Vinay Lal says, with a new diaspora. It is not associated with the old diaspora, right? Because it is the post-World War II period. And initially you see there is a labor class which travels to help rebuild Europe after the Second World War. But most importantly, the kind of diaspora that we are euphoric about, we like representing, is this diaspora of skilled labor that starts moving after the Second World War to various places in the First World. And the brain drain that you see in the 1970s, 1980s, And this is reflected in the US in particular, as opposed to other places where people have migrated because of the American policies, basically after the Second World War, where they allowed only skilled labor to enter. You have a large Indian community of skilled labor, and they are the sort of romantic, nostalgic, privileged diaspora that we encounter. So now we need to understand the concerns of both these diasporas. The concerns of both these diasporas are not identical, because as I said, as we just noted, that the old diaspora and the representation of the old diaspora is very different from the representation or the concerns of the new diaspora. And the old diaspora also, in some cases that you see in Trinidad, or you see in Africa, they also were forced to migrate multiple times. So they have context of what is called double diaspora. You know, M.G. Vasanji, for instance, his family first moved to East Africa and then he moved to Canada. So V.S. Naipaul, for example, his family at some point moved to Trinidad and he moved from Trinidad to Britain. So you see double diasporas or double displacements. But the concerns of the old diaspora are very different, because you see that in the old diaspora, there was only a romantic, nostalgic notion of myth of return, where there was no possibility of them actually returning. So once they left for good, right? And there is a rupture, a permanent sort of rupture when they left. And there is a beautiful novel called Jahajin. I'm sure some of you have already read it, by Peggy Mohan. And I'll take a very, very small, a few lines from it to describe this process of rupture, of possibility of no return, right? So this is when the protagonist first ventures out of the waters from the docks of Calcutta, Khidirpur, and says, so this was the Kala Pani, the black water that was supposed to change you forever, turn you into an outcast, water all the way to the end of the world. Now our boat started to pick up speed and head out straight towards the dark water of the open sea. And at that moment, it suddenly came to me that I was never going back, that I would live and die across the Kala Pani. Kallu came and sat down next to me on the deck, and I put my arm around his shoulders and held him close. I turned my head back to get one last look at the coastline we were leaving behind us. And then I turned to face forward and sat looking at the sea, stretching out forever and ever in front of us. And I stifled the panic rising inside me and tried to think. Right? But you see, in the old diaspora, in specifically the gender question is a very complicated one. But in a lot of narratives related to the old diaspora, where you see this rupture, this permanent dislocation, as it were, you also see a simultaneous freedom to explore new identities, right? In particular, in the case of caste and gender, right? Caste is something that you will that is dealt with. I'm not discussing it today, but you should definitely read it. Amitav Ghosh's Sea of Puppies, where he actually talks about this migration, and he talks about how caste identities, once you left that coastline, once you crossed the Kalapani, how they could be negotiated. And in Ramabai Espinet's The Swinging Bridge, you see exactly that. You see widows. And the main protagonist here is the author's great grandmother, who was a widow and who was otherwise consigned to a life of drudgery in Benares as a very, very young widow. and when she somehow finds her way to this ship and she goes to Trinidad, that she finds a new life. She's able to renegotiate her position and forge a new identity. And this particular text is full of songs that her great grandmother wrote. And I'm going to quote one particular song for you, which I think is illustrative of the point that I just made right now. Where Gainder, who is the author's or the narrator's great grandmother, she says, "Free as the birds up sinking high, free as the wind up in the sky, free as the world that is my home, free anywhere that I might roam, free when I laugh and when I sing, free in my way with everything, freer than wind and stars and rain, free in this land, free from stain, free as a little child, free as a little child, free, free again," right? Something she would not have been allowed in her homeland, right? She would be consigned to a life of drudgery, of among numerous thousands of widows in Benares. A very, very difficult life to there, where she can live as a free child. Now, I talked about old colonialism as essentially only about people who were forced to migrate. But there were some interesting people who migrated and who wrote about their experiences, who were not necessarily part of this indentured labor, as it were. One such text is a very interesting one and is widely regarded actually as the first text of Indian writing in English. So this is called The Travels of Deen Muhammad, a native of Patna in Bengal, India, right? And this was published in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. And Muhammad writes this travels in the form of letters addressed to people of Ireland, and he in the epistolary form. So there are 36 letters that he writes, and they're all addressed to "Dear Sir," trying to explain to people of Ireland what life is like in India, since he's seen as some sort of an exotic creature. And he was, as I gave you a quotation, it's very interesting that he was somebody who started a saloon in Ireland, and he was basically he was also appointed as what was called shampooing surgeon to King George IV. So he was the one who introduced shampooing, and it comes from the word champi, which is to we know what champi is, right? And he introduces this to the people of England, and he also started a cafe selling Indian curry called Hindustani Cafe. But most importantly, he's remembered for somebody who introduced shampoo to the English. So he settled down in Ireland and he writes this book, right? He's definitely part of an old diaspora, which is privileged, and uses this privilege to change, to talk about race relations, to talk about or orient, or who is in a position to articulate in English, to reorient the politics around the representation of the natives of the British Empire in England. And I'm just quoting from the first letter, from the introduction of the first letter, to give you a little bit of sense into what kind of writing this was and how political, in fact, this writing was. "Dear Sir, since my arrival in this country, I find you have been very anxious to be made acquainted to the early part of my life," right? And here you get a similar sense of alienation, that they don't feel he's necessarily part of the Irish community. "When I first came to Ireland, I found the face of everything about me 2, contrasted to the striking scenes in India, which we are to survey with a kind of sublime delight, right? Though I acknowledge myself incapable of doing justice to the merits of men whose happy manners are worthy the imitation of civilized nations. So, if you look at the two sentences here, one after the other, that I've arranged, it's very interesting that he's not apologetic about the life that he has left behind, right? He doesn't obviously find Indians uncivilized. On the other hand, the way that he represents them, he says that whose happy manners are worthy the imitation of civilized nations. So he's turning the tables around, and he is using the same kind of, very interestingly, the same kind of lens that was used in Orientalist writings about India. He says that in the previous line, if you see, he says, contrasted to the striking scenes in India, which we are to survey with a kind of sublime delight, right? So he's not the sort of scenes that he sees in Ireland. He thinks about striking scenes in India, and he feels a sense of sublime delight. He's not ashamed, or he doesn't feel that he needs to distance himself from these scenes that he describes in India. Quite the other way around. So you have this kind of very interesting diasporic writing from the old diaspora as well. Now we come to the new diaspora. Right? In the new diaspora, again, you have at least two kinds of narratives, I would suggest. One is the one that we are familiar with, the diaspora that privileges, the diaspora that we want to associate with, the diaspora that talks of nostalgia, the diaspora that romanticizes a notion of the homeland that they've left behind. And these are diasporas of privilege, right? One particular, short story that best illustrates all these points is from The Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. The name of the short story is called Mrs. Sen's, and where Mrs. Sen is basically, her name, first name, is never mentioned because it is not considered necessary. She's just somebody who is, her only identity is her identity that is tied to her husband, and she babysits a child called Elliot, and it is through the perspective of the child that you get to see Mrs. Sen. And he says, and this is the sort of nostalgia, celebratory sort of nostalgia that is a marker of the diasporas of privilege, where Eliot describes two things that makes Mrs. Sen happy. Two things learned Eliot made Mrs. Sen happy. One was the arrival of a letter from her family. It was her custom to check the mailbox after her driving practice, and then he goes on to describe how delighted she would be. She would, excitedly call her husband after she received the letter. She would share the news with Elliot, and she would feel extremely happy throughout the day after she has received this inland letter. The other thing is a very tangible connection that she has with her motherland, with her original identity. The other thing that made Mrs. Sen happy was fish from the seaside. It was always a whole fish she desired, not shellfish or fillets. Elliot's mother had broiled one night a few months ago when she invited a man from her office. One evening, when Elliot's mother came to pick him up, Mrs. Sen served her a tuna croquette, explaining that it was really supposed to be made with a fish called bhetki. It is very frustrating, Mrs. Sen apologized, in an emphasis on the second syllable of the word. Right, so her alienation is complete. Like she wants to replicate a culture that she has left behind, and these are remnants. These are material, material realities that sort of tie her to her culture, which becomes her source of identity in a country where she's a sari wearing woman, where she clearly feels alienated, she's unable to drive, unable to socialize, unable to assimilate. Okay, so her identity is constituted by these remnants, these material little bits of material reality through which she constitutes, through which she cultivates this notion of nostalgia. The other is again a collection of short stories from Canada by Shauna Singh Baldwin, called Montreal, 1962, where again this sort of privileged diaspora, the skilled people who migrated to Canada, and their sort of their inability, the inability of the host culture to understand them, and their feeling of alienation, and their discovery of their selves and their identities in the process. And I'm going to just quote a very short bit from this particular short story called Montreal, 1962, where the protagonist goes to a dry cleaner. And today I took one of the wedding saris to the neighborhood dry cleaner, and a woman with no eyebrows held it like a dish rag and asked me, "Is it a bed sheet?" "No," I said. "Curtains?" "No." I took the silk back to our basement apartment, tied my hair in a tight bun, washed the heavy folds in the metal bathtub, and hung it, gold threads glinting, on a drip dry hanger. So look at the sort of process in this very, very short, 2 paragraphs that I quoted. You will find that there is a sense of alienation, but there is also a sense of adapting, that she comes back, she ties her hair in a tight bun, she washes it in the metal tub, she makes use of, she is carrying a bit of the material culture that she has left behind, and she processes it in this new culture that or the new space, a diasporic space that has been provided to her, makes good use of it and turns around, preserving her cultural identity in the process and probably creating a new one. So a lot now is also written in this new diaspora. We have to understand that this is not the only diaspora that we need to study. We also need to study diasporas. Currently, there are very important contexts, very important ideas of migration, which are forced migration because of economics, and as Amitav Ghosh has pointed out, also because of the change in climate. And he has in particular written a lot about displacement related to the Sundarbans, the rise of the sea level, and the swallowing up of land and people's displacement, which are forcing people to migrate to better economies. And there are Benjamin from Kerala, for instance, has also written this book called Jasmine Days on the labor class from Kerala in the Arab countries, not necessarily the skilled labor that we are talking about. So this also allows us to look at class relations, to look at various kinds of marginalizations that also exist in these diasporic communities. That these diasporic communities are not necessarily a homogeneous, feel-good sort of culture that helps the soft power of the host country, that valorizes, that romanticizes by prioritizing only certain cultural elements and working on that. And I'm going to read just 2 paragraphs from his latest novel called The Gun Island, which talks about Bangladeshi immigrants and immigrants from the Sundarbans via Africa, I'm sorry, into Italy. Right. In fact, he talks about how these Bangladeshi migrants are the ones who are running all these quote unquote authentic pizza shops in Italy. The refugees on the deck of the blue boat now began to wave at us, right? So the protagonist is on a rescue boat, and the blue boat is the boat of the migrants who are trying to cross the seas from Africa, from Libya, actually, and trying to enter Italy. An answering cheer of welcome went up from Lucania, but it was quickly drowned out by the angry roars from the vessels around us. So this is also very direct political resistance that these kind of migrations, unlike the migrations of privilege, unlike the diasporas of privilege, face very different kinds of contexts and identities that you find. People who are not legal migrants, as it were. Go back from where you came from, not needed here, Europe for Europeans. It struck me now that the resemblances were not incidental. In some ways, the plight of these refugees were indeed similar to that of the indentured laborers who had been transported from the Indian subcontinent to the distant corners of the globe in order to work in the plantations. Coolies, too, had been mainly young and overwhelmingly male. Then, too, dalals and other middlemen had been essential cogs in the machinery of transportation. Then, too, debt and money lending had been vital to the oiling of the machine. Then, as now, trafficking in human beings had been an immensely lucrative form of commerce. So I wanted to highlight this particular paragraph because I think it beautifully ties to what we were discussing in terms of the old diaspora, that Amitav Ghosh reminds us that the new diaspora is not necessarily celebratory in nature, that this is not, as Vinay Lal said, that late modernity celebrates a kind of diaspora. So Ghosh actually points out that there is a kind of historical continuity in terms of how we can see this diaspora. These diasporas are better aligned to the old diasporas with possibly no possibility of return given their economic status, given their illegal status, that they will continue to live underground. They will be marginalized. They will not be documented. And that they will continue to live lives almost exactly as the old diaspora. They were driven there because of economic necessities, very similar to this diaspora. So I think I use this idea to puncture a notion of a homogeneous understanding of South Asian diasporas. That we need to understand another thing that we could perhaps discuss here is the new kind of writing that is coming, especially from the US, about what is called the Dalit diaspora, where the caste, where caste identities are also replicated. They do not necessarily get erased. Gender caste identities do not necessarily get erased when one moves from one cultural location to other. They might get renegotiated, but they are not necessarily getting erased. So as much as we look at the diaspora of privilege to understand certain points of entry, to look at questions of identity, we should also look at diasporas which are at the margins, right? Disprivileged diasporas. And in a similar way, when we look at the old diaspora, we need not necessarily look at only the indentured labor and see them as representatives, as I've tried to show you, that you can also puncture that with other negotiations with colonialism, with race identity, that also the privileged diaspora engaged in. So I think what we can take away from understanding this diaspora is that this liminal space, as Bhabha points out, this liminal space provides us with very important ways of entering complex social organization, complex cultural organizations, which otherwise homogeneous identities do not promote. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, for listening to me. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was extremely informative. So now the forum is now open to ask questions. So if anyone has any questions, so please either raise your hand or type it out in the chat box.
Participants, please respond. You may type your questions in the chat box, or you may unmute, or you may raise your hands.
Madam, am I audible? Hello.
Yes, yes.
Hello.
You're audible. Yes.
Yes, yes. Madam, can we say the celebration of nostalgia is possible only in case of second generation diasporic writer? Or is it possible in case of first generation diasporic writers also?
I don't think so. I mean, celebration of nostalgia, I think as I see it, or the way that we have seen in the writing is not necessarily just of the second generation. It is there in first generation also, but it necessarily comes from a privileged diaspora. Not, I would say that it is colored by class privilege more often than not than a generational. But yes, you are right in some sense that the second generation tends to do it probably much more because
Yes.
they are once removed from these narratives.
Yes, as I've gone through the novel like the namesake, that I've seen the characters like Asima and Ashok Ganguly. On the other hand, I've also seen the characters like Nikolai Gogol and Sonia. So on the basis of that, this is what I was thinking that the celebration of nostalgia is possible. I think in most of the cases, it is possible only in case of second generation immigrants, I think.
Yeah, but I think it has to do with privilege.
Yes.
More than necessary.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so now I would like to call Mr. Nilesh Shumay, sir. If you don't have any other questions now, then does anyone has any questions?
Afrin, you may check the chat box too.
Shilpa?
No, there aren't any.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so should we proceed?
Yeah.
Okay, so now I would like to call Mr. Nilesh Shumay, Assistant Professor, Department of English, SND Women's University, to kindly deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Good evening to the Honorable Chief Guest, respected Principal, my colleagues, and dear students. It gives me immense pleasure to propose the vote of thanks. I would like to thank our resource person, Dr. Drupadi Chattopadhyay, who honored this function with the scholarly talk. Our students as well as the teachers would surely be benefited. Listening to you, ma'am, was like a intellectual feast. I would also like to thank our beloved principal, Dr. Rajendra Gurav, for always supporting such events. I express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Pandurang Barkale, head of the department, for organizing such event. I am thankful to Professor Shifa for introducing the speaker. Many thanks to Professor Afrin for comparing the event flawlessly. I thank all the students for showing the interest in the program and making it a grand success. Thank you very much to all of you. Over to you, Afrin.
Thank you so much, sir. So, am I audible?
Yes, Afrin, you're audible.
So, on behalf of the Department of English, I extend a really hearty vote of thanks to Dr. Chattopadhyay, who spared time from a busy schedule to grace the occasion. And ma'am, your presence had made this day a very memorable one. Thank you so much. I'm immensely thankful to our head of the department, Dr. Pandurang Barkale, sir, for his efforts towards organizing such an informative expert lecture. I also extend thanks to all the staff members for their enormous cooperation. Last but not the least, I would like to thank everyone present here, especially the students, for attending this program. We value you and every moment wish that you stay in our lives in the temple of learning. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Afrin.
Welcome.
Yeah, I think if there are no formalities left, we'll call it a day. Drupadi ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am,
for listening to me. Thank you so much.
It was really a pleasure and honor too. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay,
Take care,
thanks.
everyone.
Okay.
And once
Stay
again,
home,
ma'am,
stay safe.
hearty congratulations for becoming HOD of the department.
Oh, it's more
Yeah.
of a responsibility than
Yeah.
anything. Yeah, but I thank you so much, and I'll
Yeah.
expect all of you. We can work together and better
Yeah.
the department in every possible way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.